For the second half of Unit 3, we'll turn our attention to autobiographical writing. In particular, we'll look at excerpts from Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery and Gertrude Simmons' Impressions of an Indian Childhood. These autobiographical works do not belong, strictly speaking, to the realism movement. They are autobiography and therefore not necessarily fiction. But the rise of ethnic autobiography corresponds to the age of realism and its other modes, regionalism and local color, so it's worth our while to look at them together. We also see elements of fictional form in these works, especially in Impressions of an Indian Childhood. Sakala Shah uses images like the land of little apples that help to characterize changes in her own life and in the lives of other Native Americans at this time. Let's start with Gertrude Simmons Bonin. That was the Anglo name of Sakala Shah, which translates as Red Bird. She was Yankton Sioux, born in South Dakota during a moment of great cultural change. Like regionalist writers Sarah Orne Jewett, Mary Wilkins Freeman, and Soy Sin Far, Sakala Shah depicts a female-centered universe and her own refusal to be silenced. Her work also plays on a motif popular in colonial American writing, the Indian captivity narrative, which you may remember from the first half of the American Literature Survey. But here, Sakala Shah recounts her capture by palefaces, and that's her word, not mine. She is removed from the reservation and forced to assimilate into mainstream culture, just as the characters in Henry James and Edith Wharton's travels to Europe. Sakala Shah also travels to another country. In Impressions, Sakala Shah provides an ethnography of sorts, a study of people or culture, and draws a distinction between different ways of interacting with the environment. She conveys to us the sense of a changing culture and landscape in the image of the stretch of telegraph poles across the country and of the trains that are passing through her territory. On page 1093, she writes, "Very near my mother's dwelling, along the edge of a road thickly bordered with wild sunflowers, some poles like these had been planted by white men. Often I had stopped on my way down the road to press my ear against the pole, and hearing its low moaning, I used to wonder what the paleface had done to hurt it." This passage illustrates the way Anglo-American culture has spread across the contiguous United States, but it also conveys cultural difference. She suggests that Anglo-Americans are cold. They plant wood poles that, while technologically advanced, will not grow like sunflowers. She also conveys cultural difference in her descriptions of visiting members of her community on page 1089. She writes, "Running all the way to the wigwams, I halted shyly at the entrances. Sometimes I stood long moments without saying a word. It was not any fear that made me so dumb when out upon such a happy errand, nor was it that I wished to withhold the invitation, for it was all I could do to observe this very proper silence. But it was a sensing of the atmosphere, to assure myself that I should not hinder other plans. My mother used to say to me, as I was almost always bounding away from the old people, 'Wait a moment before you invite anyone. If other plans are being discussed, do not interfere, but go elsewhere.'" So here she's telling us that she isn't naturally quiet. She's resisting that stereotype of the silent or the dumb Indian. Instead, she has been taught to be observant, quiet, and deferential. She has been encouraged to look for subtext in a conversation. These are qualities that are valued in her community and culture, and they're not as valued in the Anglo-American world that she begins to enter. Mirroring the regionalist writers, Sakala Shah shows resistance to the encroachment on her culture. We see also resistance to ethnocentrism and racism. She shows us her mother's distress and anger over losing lands to palefaces, her term for Anglo-Americans. Her mother also resents the palefaces who have encroached upon not only their land and culture, but who have also introduced diseases from which native populations have little or no resistance. At the same time, her mother acknowledges the need for adaptation, which is why she relents to her daughter's request to go to the paleface school. Pay attention to the many forms resistance takes in Sakala Shaw's impressions. There are overt forms of resistance. These include her refusal to see positive aspects of palefaces in her opening chapter, her descriptions of native culture as highly developed. They are nomadic, but they have very elaborate customs regarding storytelling, entertaining, etc. And we also see it in her refusal to convert to Christianity, which marks her as very different from other Native American writers who have published before her. And there's lots of loss in this autobiography. This is signaled by details such as the medicine bag she procures in chapter 7 as a precautionary measure, but the loss of the bag precedes her loss of faith. Resistance also comes in the trajectory of the narrative. This is a success story in many ways. She succeeds in the white man world, but it is not wholly satisfying. She wins an oratory contest, for example, in which she faces racist comments from those she competes against. She feels satisfaction at winning, which she describes as an evil spirit, but it doesn't last long. She writes in the last paragraph on page 1100, "The little taste of victory did not satisfy a hunger in my heart. In my mind, I saw my mother far away on the eastern plains, and she was holding a charge against me." This is a complicated response. She believes she has failed her mother. Success as an individual does not equate a larger success for Sioux and other Native Americans. Like Sakala Shaw, Booker T. Washington's autobiography enacts resistance, both overt and subversive. The act of writing an autobiography, which is a representation of the self, is to insist on one's subjectivity. Subjectivity is the quality or condition of being a subject, an individual who possesses agency and conscious experiences such as perspectives, feelings, beliefs, and desires. This is the opposite of being objectified, the quality of being degraded to the status of an object rather than as an individual. Both Sakala Shaw and Booker T. Washington, as you know, belong to racial groups that have been objectified in literature. Native Americans and African Americans have always already been defined, but these writers now in their works write against that objectification. Writing his life is a complicated act for Booker T. Washington. This is evident when we compare his autobiography to that of Benjamin Franklin, a work that sets the standard for American autobiography. In Franklin's first chapter, he traces his ancestry and early life. Indulge me a little bit while I read some of it. Franklin writes, "The notes one of my uncles furnished me with several particulars relating to our ancestors. From these notes, I learned that the family had lived in the same village, Ecton, in North Hampshire for 300 years, on a freehold of about 30 acres, aided by the Smiths' business, which had continued in the family till his time, the eldest son being always bred to that business, a custom which he and my father followed as to their eldest son." So he's tracing this back 300 years. "When I searched the registers at Ecton, I found an account of their births, marriages, and burials from the year 1555 only, there being no registers kept in that parish at any time preceding. By that register, I perceived that I was the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations back. My grandfather Thomas, who was born in 1598, lived at Ecton till he grew too old to follow business longer, and then he went to live with his son John, a dyer at Banbury in Oxfordshire, with whom my father served an apprenticeship. There my grandfather died and lies buried. We saw his gravestone in 1758. His eldest son, Thomas, lived in the house at Ecton and left it with the land to his only child, a daughter, who with her husband sold it to Mr. Eisted, now Lord of the Manor there. My grandfather had 4 sons that grew up. They were Thomas, John, Benjamin, and Josiah. I will give you what account I can of them at this distance from my papers, and if these are not lost in my absence, you will among them find many more particulars. Okay, I read this so that you could really hear in this passage that Franklin has a lot of access to information about his ancestry, and he can trace them across great geographical and historical distance. Booker T. Washington, on the other hand, has no clue about his ancestral lineage. He has no way of finding out either. Let's look at the first paragraph on page 675, in which Washington writes, I was born a slave on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. I am not quite sure of the exact place or the exact date of my birth, but at any rate, I suspect I must have been born somewhere and at some time. He makes light of it, but there's no record of him as a person, a legal record. In the second paragraph, he tells us, of my ancestry, I know almost nothing. He doesn't even know his father's identity. He only knows that he was white and from a neighboring plantation. There's no registry to consult, and folks don't want to talk about it. There's a story hidden here about the relationship between his parents. His father failed to recognize his son. The silence suggests that this wasn't a relationship his mother could speak of, and we wonder if it was even consensual. Yet despite this, Washington writes on page 675, 4 lines from the bottom, whoever his father was, I never heard of his taking the least interest in me or providing in any way for my rearing, but I do not find a special fault with him. He was simply another unfortunate victim of the institution which the nation unhappily had engrafted upon it at that time. In other words, slavery was bad for white folks too. Later generations have viewed Washington's emphasis on Anglo-Americans to be problematic. He essentially relieves them of any culpability. It was not individuals, but instead the institution of slavery that is at fault. His message is that we are in this together, and the former slaves wouldn't hold past actions against former Southern slave owners. Washington also appeals to white readers and supporters rather than to African Americans when he expresses the belief that African Americans deserved and would one day achieve equal civil rights, but that those rights could not be demanded. Instead, they would have to be freely given by Southern white people. On page 697 of Up From Slavery, Washington asserts that it is the duty of the Negro to deport himself modestly in regard to political claims, depending upon the slow but sure influences that proceed from the possession of property, intelligence, and high character for the full recognition of his political rights. He argues furthermore that African Americans should not cease voting, but also urges them to be more and more influenced by white people in the way they cast their ballots. Understandably, some critics have seen these positions as naive and problematically deferential to white oppression. But it is important to view his statements in the context of the turn of the 20th century. Washington's deference can be understood as pragmatic and even as a crafty rhetorical stance. In support of this, let's consider Washington's observations about plantation songs on page 682, and I'm looking about 8 lines from the top. Here he writes, most of the verses of the plantation songs had some reference to freedom. True, they had sung those same verses before, but they had been careful to explain that the freedom in these songs referred to the next world and no connection with life in this world. Now they gradually threw off the mask and were not afraid to let it be known that the freedom in their songs meant freedom of the body in this world and not in heaven. Let's apply this idea of expressing a dangerous idea in secret to Washington's autobiography. With this in mind, we might suppose that Washington is wearing a mask to appease white supporters of his cause. And we know that his autobiography was written for white audiences. Literary scholars have come to see that Washington spoke with multiple messages in mind. In works like the autobiography, which was written in part to raise money for African American education, he sought to appease Anglo-American donors and policymakers. Thus, he was reticent and restrained in his charges and demands. Privately, he worked tirelessly to undo the effects of institutional and cultural racism, while publicly in these works, he hides that. All throughout the autobiography, he calls our attention to the way slavery and poverty affects the choices made by individuals. So he's always looking, like naturalist writers, at social context. His mother stole food to feed her children, and he deceived an employer by changing the hands of the clock so he could leave work early to go to school. While evaluating these actions, we must do so in the context of slavery and poverty. And although he paints a portrait of African Americans in need, he resists the notion that those of African descent want to remain in slavery. Although Washington seems to have compromised with white Southerners and white Americans in general, he worked in deepest secret to undermine the compromise and advance the social and economic position of blacks.